Welcome to The Fine Print, the podcast exploring the law, its impact, and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Riddell, and today I'm honored to welcome Ms. Mariana Negreiros, a lawyer with the specialization in environmental law. Her work spans the EU, US, and Latin America with a rare combination of legal expertise, global experience, and visionary thinking. She has helped Fortune 500 companies, startups, and nonprofits tackle some of the world's toughest environmental and social challenges. From developing climate risk frameworks with strong legal grounding to leading compliance projects under the EU deforestation regulation, Ms. Negrerios is helping businesses use the law to make real, positive environmental change. So, to start us off, what initially inspired you to pursue a career in environmental law?
And first, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting project, and I'm glad that to be part of the Fine Print podcast today. Thank you, Rudal. So, starting answer your question, I was born and raised in Brazil. So I grew up seeing two things very clearly. One hand, noticed and I saw and I experienced social and economic inequalities by first hand. And on the other, I see and I experience the extraordinary richness of the Brazil's natural environment, the forests, the beaches, the animal life. So it was the beauty, but also the vulnerability. But the real turning point was after I started my law degree. It was especially after an experience that I had in Pará, that is a state in the middle of the Amazon forest. It's actually the region that the COP30 is being hosted. And being there, seeing the magnificence of the rivers, the power of the forest, talking to locals, everything changed for me and made me realize how urgent it is to protect the environment, protect the local people, and how vulnerable we are. So that is where I understood that my purpose, my work will follow this path, the environmental law, and the fight for nature, the planet, and the humans. So I connect my background, my values, my desire to contribute to something bigger than myself. And it's being a challenge.
Thank you for sharing your journey, especially how, your experience in Brazil has allowed you to see different perspectives in the country and your turning point in protecting the environment overall. So, how do you define environmental justice and how does it guide your legal approach?
Thank you for asking this question. I think it's a core principle and value that I fight for. But I will start by explaining what environmental injustice is before talking about environmental justice. The environmental injustice happens when people who contributed the least to climate change, often communities, indigenous people, coastal and rural populations, are the ones who felt the strongest impacts of the climate change. For example, rising of the sea level, extreme heat, biodiversity loss, they witnessed by firsthand. And many of these impacts are driven by big emitters, by large corporations. So the burden falls on those who didn't create the problem. So this is environmental injustice. And environmental justice is the opposite. It's about making sure that environmental harms and benefits are shared fairly and recognized by the power behind these decisions, who gets protected, who gets to listen to, and who ends up being left behind. So environmental justice tries to balance this approach. And this idea shaped my legal approach and my background. And I studied deeply this concept in my LLM dissertation that I did in London. I looked to the flows that happened in a state in Brazil. It's called Rio Grande do Sul in 2024, where more than 400 cities were underwater. Millions of people were affected. And the disaster over there wasn't just natural because it rained a lot in this year. The climate change, of course, played a role, but what made more this catastrophe were the legal, political, and historical structures over there, many of them rooted on Brazil's post-colonial governance. So my research aims to show how environmental laws even when they look progressive on paper, because the world thinks that Brazil has progressive regulation, but sometimes they fail in practice because they are shaped by old power dynamics. So most vulnerable communities end up carrying the harvest burden, and environmental injustice is happening in real time and is happening now all over the world. So we have to fight and to be aware of this concept.
That really brings insight on environmental injustice and what that means as a concept. To put it concisely, how third parties are getting affected the most by the actions of others, as explained in your later examples of the government also affecting these vulnerable people, and how this concept inherently contrasts with the idea of environmental justice. So, adding on to that, how effective are current climate policies in balancing development and environmental preservation?
Well, we can talk about how effective the climate policies are today. And I can speak from a very recent experience, like this week experience, actually. I've been working closely with the EU climate and sustainability regulations. And this year has been a turning point, and unfortunately, for the wrong direction. The EU was leading the global regulation for and pro sustainability. We had like three landmarks, the regulations that was the CSRD, which requires company to report on sustainability matters, CSDDD, that focus on human rights and environmental due diligence across supply chains, and the UDR, that is the deforestation law. So it's a regulation to protect products to enter in Europe if they are linked to deforestation. All these were created to push companies forward a fair and cleaner business models. But this year, the political landscape in Europe changed, and a package called Omnibus was approved, which delays, simplifies these regulations, and even raised the thresholds that so many companies are they don't no longer have to comply with. So in practice, it slowed down the transition and creates room for business to postpone change and to for they to put as a burden in the companies or something that they're going to do later. And the same time, we can see the interest contradiction. Just last week, countries get together in COP30 and they agree on new commitments to reduce green gases emissions. So we can hear ambitious climate goals from governments, but the same governments are working to weakening and delay the tools to achieve this. So it's very contradictory, and this is how work with environmental law is how my work it is. But I saw a post of a politician that is in the EU, is a member of the European Parliament, that she was pushing to these laws being effective. She's Marie Peter Hansen, and she posted a phrase that is kind of optimistic, that we can only rely on politicians to push through necessary change, but we always can count on people's drive and the hope for a better future. So this phrase, I think, resonates for this week.
Yeah, I love that quote. And I honestly think that it's unfortunate to see that not in all cases balancing development and environmental preservation is simple. And sometimes choices have to be made in order to favor one or the other, as well as hearing governments and intergovernmental organizations talk about a more sustainable future, but their words don't always match their actions and they're not backed as effectively. So, furthermore, what are some trends that you're observing in environmental law? Perhaps any future trends that you're observing?
Okay, one big trend that I see the rise, and I like to read and understand more about it, is climate litigation. Climate litigation is when people, communities, even children are going to court to proceed against some measures of companies or even governments. And we're seeing more of these cases than ever. And these cases are shaping public awareness in a way that politics alone can often do actions by themselves. So these cases are pushing the societies through another to awareness. Yeah, we saw this week that the Court of London decided on a matter in Brazil that happened a disaster in 2015 about in a state of Minas Gerais. That was a dam that exploded because of issues that they didn't keep the dam safe. They didn't made adjustments or so you can see that something Court of London have an impact in Brazil. So this is a climate litigation case that brought out a lot of awareness in the industry, in the news, or even in social media. And two research centers that I follow closely to map this global movement is led by two Brazilians. One is the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, led by Maria Antonio Tigre. And the other is the Grantham Search Institute at London School of Economics that is led by Joanna Stanzer. And they always publish articles about all these cases all around the world. They get together like the trends, what is happening, how the impact of these cases was. And even litigation should be always the last resource because at the time that the case reaches the court, the harm is already done. I think is a trend that is pushing stronger mitigation, adaptation, and awareness. And you see how many children and youth that is entering this movement as well and fighting against the climate, fighting with and against the climate change. And it's something so beautiful to study and to present.
That's so fascinating. You know, climate litigation in itself is such an interesting concept. From what I understand, it aims to hold those in power, such as governments or MNCs, accountable for their actions, which may be effective. But as you mentioned in your last bit, by the time these cases reach the court, the damage has already been done. So I guess it'll be interesting to see how more cases like these, phase out. So, moreover, talking about some of the challenges in environmental law, what do you feel are some of the biggest challenges in this field?
Well, we have a lot of challenges in this field because it's very dynamic. But one that I think is important for us to highlight it here is the huge data gap in environmental law, especially when we compare the North and the Global South. If you look to databases, reports, we have a lot of things for the Global North, but to the Global South, where the climate, the hazards, that the global warming are being more abrupt. The facts are being more abrupt. We can have this much access to the data, but this is something that we can overcome little by little, seeing the new regulations, the more invest in technology, even hosting the COP30 in Brazil is a way of seeing that this gap is changing. So there is a growing ecosystem of research and frameworks that can give me a great optimism. And another big challenge is how to build a bridge between awareness, political, and the money. Yes, we need to more than have laws and make laws and climate litigation and go to the courts, is to have things in the reality. Is take this thing out of the paper.
I really appreciate that viewpoint, and I think you've definitely highlighted and summarized the key challenges in the field in a way that's very effective and allows our audience to understand these kinds of complexities in this dynamic field of environmental law. So, speaking a bit more on politics and the environment, what ethical tensions arise when environmental protection conflicts with economical or political interests?
Well, when environmental protection clashes with economic and political interests, usually it comes to down the short-term gains and profit versus the long-term responsibility. this is a challenge that I face daily in my business practice. So many actors, including politicals, CEO levels, companies, still see sustainability and environmental regulation as a cost, as a burden, and something that will slow the profits. And the irony is that it is the opposite. We already have solid research showing that integrating environmental and sustainability practice strengthens resilience, reduce costs, reduce risks, and can actually improve profit over time, employee happiness, and many other things. That is something for me so easy to see, but I have to learn how to convince people that don't see the way it is. So the ethical tension becomes like, do we prioritize the immediate financial or political convenience, or do we can act or seek evidence or make projects that will take time, but it will be better for the economy, for the planet, for the people?
I can definitely see that. The short term gains and the long term differences of investing in sustainable measures and methods really highlights the clashes with economical or political interests of a nation, notably Brazil, as you mentioned. So, on that note, how has technology and globalization in general affected environmental law?
Technology and globalization have brought both benefits and challenge to environmental law. Most like everything on the environmental field, you have this double edge. But I'm going to talk about the positive side because technology has transformed the way we monitor and understand the environmental challenge. And this is something beautiful to understand and see. A good example is the Amazon Face project. They put some towers in the Amazon forest to increase the CO levels to study how the ecosystem will respond in the future. And this seems a project of dystopic future, but actually it's happening right now, and will help us understand if the Amazon will stand with us against the fight against climate change, or is something that won't be an asset for us. So this kind of data help policymakers design better law, companies to measure the impact, give scientists tools and find solution, and bring people awareness and how they can see and touch the effects. So technology also creates new pressures, more electronic waste, higher water consumption in industries, new form of pollutions, and globalization amplifies it because we are all interconnected. But I think as we are living in this world that we are deeply interconnected 24 hours on the phones and with access to the internet, environmental law has to respond to these issues and act across the borders. So our challenge is to decide how we're going to use the technology and the globalization in a ways that will strengthen our environmental protection.
That's such a clear breakdown of the advantages and disadvantages of technology and globalization, and just using that power to strengthen environmental law as a whole, especially a bit on the Amazon Face project. I've heard about it, and I definitely agree that it's such a great initiative to restore the Brazilian Amazon, especially with their use of technology. So, I have a question for you personally. So, how do you ensure that vulnerable communities are meaningfully represented in environmental cases? I knew we spoke a bit about this in terms of environmental injustice, but I was curious as to how you tackle these kinds of situations.
So on my daily work practices, I work more with companies and how they gonna report on the matters and their behavior, because I really think that I want to be where the money is because I want to change everything. And this is the way I try to approach it. And is talking to the C level and talking to people who has the power to decide in the company to show the other needs. That is the environment. If it's a company, a petrochemical company, how they will preserve the communities surrounding where they extract their materials. If it is a company that use a lot of water, how they gonna work and reuse this water. So I am trying to sit with the decisions maker in the companies and try to bring a more ethical sides on that. And on the side of my academic work, I really try to study and try to bring this concept to cases in practices. For example, the flooding that happened in Brazil, there was milestone for climate awareness. So in my daily life, I try to bring this to the table where the decisions are being made. And of course, I have my side of volunteering, and so that I have more connection face to face with locals and indigenous communities as I can.
That's such a great point, honestly. And I think it's so important to be with the companies and just ensure that they're also complying with, ethical standards and environmental regulations. So do you believe that lawyers have an ethical duty to advocate for future generations? And if so, does this show up in your practice or, in terms of your research or volunteer work?
Well, yes, I do believe that lawyers have to work with ethic before everything. So even for future generations. And I think we are in a point that we can deny that the planet is warming and the hazards are increasing and we are feeling the effects. So for me, there is no way to come back. I always try to push awareness and bring to the table different perspectives, even for representing the youth. I believe you have a voice and a strong voice, and you have another perspective or how the things are, because you are already born in a world with a lot of information, with a lot of technology, and you see the things different. So it's very important for the decision makers that usually are people with more practices. They are already very into this field to listen to you, and the cases being brought to the courts in climate litigations that are being held by youth is they are being very important, and I'm fascinated to study. I try to read the court files and even the news and follow the paths. So there is amount of great activists coming through that I admire so much, and this youth is so very brave that you have a voice that is going. I believe in you are the generation that will make the difference.
That's such a valuable insight. And, we've touched a lot about ethics during this whole podcast, but I think allowing, the youth also to have a representation allows for the development of future generations and future lawyers. So finally, what advice would you like to offer to aspiring law students wanting to enter this field?
Well, I always tell students that environmental law is challenge, just like any other legal field. But for me, it's a challenge that resonates differently than the others. We are dealing with issues that connect us directly to life, to people, to ecosystem, to animals, places that we depend on. And usually living in big cities, we forget. And there is something meaningful and profound about that. So my advice is to stay curious and to stay open, read widely, not just law, science, policies, history, climate reports, art, things about nature, being with animals, like because this field needs interdisciplinary approach by nature. So more you understand about the world, about the law, about the nature, you're gonna bring a better view and shape in a better way. So I think environmental law asks persistent optimism, but also is a beautiful chance to contribute to something bigger than yourself.
Those are some great pieces of advice. It demonstrates the importance of staying curious and learning more about the world, especially in such a dynamic field of environmental law, having these kind of interdisciplinary aspects shining through. So, thank you so much for your time, Ms. Negrerios. And to all my listeners, court is now adjourned. Until next time with the fine print.